Special Counsel Jack Smith's full under oath video deposition with Congress was made public today. We've published the full video deposition on our YouTube page. I recommend you watch the full video deposition, but I want to give you some of the explosive highlights right here in case you can't watch the full video deposition. But again, my recommendation is you go and watch the full deposition. Here, Special Counsel Jack Smith is being cross-examined about whether Donald Trump's statements that the election was stolen or that he won the 2020 election is simply protected First Amendment speech. And Special Counsel Jack Smith says when you use that to engage in conduct to try to tamper with the results of the election, it's no longer protected anymore. It's a criminal conspiracy. Here, play this clip.
As I sit here right now, I can't remember specific conversations. I do remember that we knew that a sort of First Amendment defense would be part of the case. And I think when I mentioned to you earlier about how to frame the case, we want to make clear that this was not about trying to interfere with anyone's First Amendment rights, that this was a fraud. And as you know, under Supreme Court precedent, fraud is not protected by the First Amendment. And so in my mind, it was important to make that clear in the indictment. And that's why when we litigated this issue before the district court, we prevailed.
But the president's statements that he believed the election was rife with fraud, those certainly are statements that are protected by the First Amendment, correct?
Absolutely not. If they are made to target a lawful government function and they're made with knowing falsity. No, they're not. That was my point about fraud not being protected by the First Amendment.
I mean, there's a long list of disputed elections. I mean, the election of 1800, 1960, year 2000, where candidates believe they were wronged by because they lost. And there's a long history of candidates speaking out about they believe there's been fraud, there's been other problems with the integrity of the election process. And I think you would agree that those types of statements are sort of at the core of the First Amendment rights of a presidential candidate, right?
There is no historical analog for what President Trump did in this case. As we said in the indictment, he was free to say that he thought he won the election. He was even free to say falsely that he won the election. But what he was not free to do was violate federal law and use knowingly false statements about election fraud to target a lawful government function. Mm-hmm. That he was not allowed to do. And that differentiates this case from any past history.
Next, Special Counsel Jack Smith is asked whether Attorney General Garland or former President Biden ever tried to influence his investigation or prosecution in any way. Were there any conversations at all about that? Special Counsel Jack Smith says no. And I want you to contrast that with right now where the Trump White House is literally controlling the DOJ's social media. And you see Trump text messaging and doing social media posts via text message or doing text messages on social media posts to Pam Bondi, say, prosecute this person, prosecute that person. Here, play this clip of Jack Smith.
There's a lot of inferences and accusations being made about your bias as a special counsel's office. And I want to make sure that we rebut these in the first hour. I think it's important too. So did the Attorney General or any other DOJ official ever press you to be more aggressive in your investigation of President Donald J. Trump?
No.
Did the Attorney General or any other DOJ official ever suggest that you were expected to bring charges against President Trump?
No.
Did anyone from the White House, including President Biden, ever tell you they expected you to bring charges against Donald Trump?
No.
When you eventually did bring charges against Donald Trump, how did you make that decision? Walk us through it at a high level, if you don't mind.
Sure. It was based on the facts and based on the law. I ultimately made that decision, but I consulted with my team of prosecutors on that case, who were outstanding public servants, people with great experience in complex investigations. I took their advice and counsel in making that decision, and I tried to consider all factors, including both the strength of the case that we believed we had, possible defenses, all things of that nature.
So which based on what you just said, it sounds like you made this prosecution decision based on the evidence in the law. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What would you have done if you felt any improper pressure from a DOJ official or the White House?
I think people who know me and have known my reputation would know that would not end well. Someone trying to pressure me to move a case in one direction or the other wasn't supported by the law. I wouldn't stand for it. And I would also say the people who worked in my office wouldn't stand for that either.
Next, Special Counsel Jack Smith's lawyer talks about getting an email the morning before Jack Smith was going to testify from Pam Bondi in the Department of Justice saying they were refusing to allow Jack Smith to talk about anything regarding the Mar-a-Lago case, where it was alleged that Donald Trump stole classified information because Volume 2 of Jack Smith's report has not been released yet by Judge Cannon because Trump and Bondi and Trump's DOJ is refusing to make it public, even though it should be, and they're doing everything they can to hide it. Jack Smith's like, I'd like to talk about this, but I'm prevented to right now because of essentially an order by Judge Cannon and the DOJ's position that I can't speak about it. So you want to depose me on it. I want to let you know what went down, but Pam Bondi's refusing to allow me to speak. Watch what went down during these proceedings. Let's play it.
According to the Justice Department, discussion of Volume 2 of the Special Counsel's report and any information or conclusions in Volume 2 or in drafts thereof is specifically prohibited by Judge Cannon's January 21st, 2025 order. This morning, just over an hour ago, the Department of Justice sent us an email affirming its view that Judge Cannon's order applies to Mr. Smith and that it precludes him from disclosing any non-public information that may be contained in Volume 2, including, but not limited to, interview transcripts, search warrant materials, business records, toll records, video footage, records obtained by grand jury subpoenas, attorney-client communications, and potential Rule 404B evidence. This restriction significantly limits Mr. Smith's ability to discuss the classified documents case. Nevertheless, Mr. Smith is committed to doing his best to answering questions consistent with the department's guidance. And I asked that email from the Department of Justice that was sent earlier this morning to be made part of the record.
And Special Counsel Jack Smith talks about how the case against Trump was built on solid evidence, and it was built on mostly Republicans who were the ones sharing Donald Trump's guilt. Here, play this clip.
One of the strengths of our case and why we felt we had such strong proof is our witnesses were not going to be political enemies of the president. They were going to be political allies. We had numerous witnesses who would say, I voted for President Trump. I campaigned for President Trump. I wanted him to win. The Speaker of the House in Arizona, the Speaker of the House in Michigan. We had an elector in Pennsylvania who is a former congressman who was going to be an elector for President Trump, who said that what they were trying to do was an attempt to overthrow the government and illegal. Our case was built on, frankly, Republicans who put their allegiance to the country before the party. And so the president got information from people he trusted on other issues. He rejected it whenever it didn't fit him staying in office. And there was a pattern in our case where anytime any information came in that would mean he could no longer be president, he would reject it. And any theory, no matter how far-fetched, no matter how not based in law, that would indicate that he could, he latched onto that. And we were confident that we had very strong proof of that pattern. He also, I would just add, very consciously did not try to reach out to the sort of people who have the most expertise on these issues. He reached out to people who he thought could back him up.
Special counsel Jack Smith talks about his career for 3 decades as a career prosecutor, the diligence, the steps, the meticulousness, the processes that he goes through. Play this clip.
For nearly 3 decades, I've been a career prosecutor. I've served during both Republican and Democratic administrations, and I've been guided by those principles in every role I've held. I continued to honor those principles when I was appointed to serve as special counsel in November of 2022. The decision to bring charges against President Trump was mine, but the basis for those charges rests entirely with President Trump and his actions, as alleged in the indictments returned by grand juries in 2 different districts. Our investigation developed proof beyond a reasonable doubt that President Trump engaged in a criminal scheme to overturn the results of the 2020 election and to prevent the lawful transfer of power. Our investigation also developed powerful evidence that showed that President Trump willfully retained highly classified documents after he left office in January of 2021, storing them at his social club, including in a ballroom and a bathroom. He then repeatedly tried to obstruct justice to conceal his continued retention of those documents. I remain grateful for the counsel, judgment, and advice of my team as I executed my responsibilities. I am both saddened and angered that President Trump has sought revenge against career prosecutors, FBI agents, and support staff simply for doing their jobs and for having worked on those cases. These dedicated public servants are the best of us, and they have been wrongly vilified and improperly dismissed from their jobs. I made my decisions in the investigation without regard to President Trump's political association, activities, beliefs, or candidacy in the 2024 presidential election. We took our actions based on the facts and the law, the very lessons I learned early in my career as a prosecutor. We followed Justice Department policies and observed legal requirements. The timing and speed of our work reflects the strength of the evidence and our confidence that we would have secured convictions at trial. If asked whether to prosecute a former president based on the same facts today, I would do so regardless of whether that president was a Republican or a Democrat. Recent narratives about my team's work are false and misleading, including stories about our collection of toll records. Toll records were sought for historical telephone routing information, collected after calls had taken place, identifying the incoming and outgoing call numbers, the time of the calls and their duration. Toll records do not include the content of calls. Those records were lawfully subpoenaed and were relevant to complete a comprehensive investigation. January 6th was an attack on the structure of our democracy in which over 140 heroic law enforcement officers were assaulted. Over 160 individuals later pled guilty to assaulting police that day. Exploiting that violence, President Trump and his associates tried to call members of Congress in furtherance of their criminal scheme, urging them to further delay certification of the 2020 election. I did not choose those members. President Trump did. I hope that my testimony today serves to correct these mischaracterizations about my work, and to that end, I welcome your questions.
Special counsel Jack Smith talks about how his investigation turned up that during January 6th, the days leading up to it and thereafter, Trump was getting calls from people he trusted. And this was also evidence of what was going on. Play this clip.
But it's pretty significant to subpoena the Speaker of the House's toll records, right?
We followed department policy and we followed all legal requirements in getting those records.
I mean, to get the information you're looking for, nobody disputed the Speaker and the President were having communications on January 6th. So one way you could have gotten that information is you could have asked the Speaker's lawyer to look at his phone records and to give you the information you needed, right?
Well, You say now that nobody's disputing, but my experience in criminal investigations is that people often at trial dispute things that you never thought were going to be in dispute during the investigation. And so when I conduct a criminal investigation, I don't assume there will be no disputes. Having a record that is a hard record about a time, and the timeline of that afternoon was particularly important because that violence started. The president refused to stop it. He endangered the life of his vice president. Then he's getting calls, and not calls from Democrats, not calls from people he doesn't know, calls from people he trusts, calls from people he relies on, and still refuses to come to the aid of the people at the Capitol. That's very important evidence for criminal intent in our case.
Jack Smith was asked if, as part of his investigation, if anybody ever tapped the phones. Did you ever wiretap or tap the phones of Senator Hawley or all these other MAGA Republicans who were whining and saying their phones were tapped? And Jack Smith's like, absolutely not. Here, play this clip.
One more question about the toll records. So in this past October, in a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing with Attorney General Bondi, Senator Josh Hawley claimed that the subpoena of his phone records was, quote, tapping his phone. As part of your investigation, did you or anyone from your office tap the phone of Senator Hawley?
No.
So is his suggestion that his phone had been tapped just simply false?
It's inaccurate.
Okay, thank you.
And just to remind you, what was subpoenaed were phone records showing if calls were made. And Special Counsel Jack Smith says, look, if a Democratic senator or Congress member was speaking with Trump and they were text messaging, the phone records would show that there were messages. That's all, not what the actual contents of the call were, but that a call took place. Special Counsel Jack Smith is asked about the Supreme Court's decision on absolute executive immunity. Play this clip.
Do you believe that the Supreme Court's decision on executive immunity constitutes an exoneration of President Trump's conduct in the months and weeks leading up to January 6th and on January 6th?
No.
Would you just explain that for us, why you don't see that as an exoneration for what he did?
Sure. I understand the Supreme Court decision. If I just go back for a second, this was an issue we litigated in the district court. The district court agreed with us. We litigated it in the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals agreed with us. We litigated in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court majority did not agree with us. They took a view of executive power that was more expansive than what we argued. I disagreed with it for the reasons we set forth in our brief and the reasons stated by the dissent in the case, Justice Sotomayor. But it is the law of the land. And what my office sought to do in responding to that was to follow the law and see, do we still have a case? And I think the evidence that we had after that decision remained powerful. I talked earlier today about state officials who put allegiance to the country before party. Those officials from Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all those witnesses, right? All those witnesses would still be available to us. The heart of our case would still be available to us. And I think it's important to know that, our view was that he abused his authority in the Justice Department to effect as one way to effectuate the scheme. This was about him as a candidate trying to say he won an election he didn't win. And so having to frame this in that manner, obviously it limited some of the evidence. That's why we had to supersede the indictment. But I don't think it was an exoneration because I still believed that there was substantial evidence that would allow us to prove the case beyond reasonable doubt.
Jack Smith talks about text message threads between Steve Bannon and Trump's lawyer Boris Epshteyn. Play this clip.
Mr. Bannon made an extraordinary video basically predicting the events of January 6th on the day before. Were you able to discover, either by interviewing Mr. Bannon or those who had knowledge of what he was doing, how he was aware of the riot before it happened?
We did not interview Mr. Bannon. I believe that particular statement you're talking about would have been part of our proof. And my recollection is that we had evidence that would indicate from some point, not immediately after the election, but shortly thereafter, sometime might have been closer to December period, that Bannon, who had been out of touch with President Trump for some period of time, got back in more regular touch with him at some time. And in fact, this is reminding me, my recollection is that we had a text thread that between Bannon and Epstein that went through a lot of this period. On that text thread, I believe it was the evening of January 6th, right around the time the senators' calls were occurring at the direction of the president. And there was an exchange between those two wherein I believe it was Epstein asked Bannon, "Are you in touch with him?" And the answer was affirmative, and it was something to the effect of, "He's still on fire." And that's right at the same time that these calls are happening, after he refused to do what he could to stop the attack on the Capitol, after the tweet about Mike Pence.
And Smith talks about his interview with Boris Epstein. Play this clip.
We had also interviewed Boris Epstein before these subpoenas were issued. He corroborated that they were, in fact, trying to call senators. He dissembled and tried to imply that the president hadn't directed him to do it, even though there was a text message saying specifically that they had. But he agreed that they tried to call these senators and that they had certain senators' numbers themselves, and so they didn't need those numbers. And that would be, I believe it was Senator Cruz, and possibly, I think he said they possibly tried to call Senator Graham as well.
Taking a step back, this might be obvious for a lot of folks, but just make sure it's clear for the record. Who is Mr. Epstein?
Boris Epstein was one of the co-conspirators in this case.
And what role did Mr. Epstein play in the larger conspiracy, if you can summarize it?
Well, he played several roles. He was involved in the fake elector scheme, and also in sort of pushing out some of these false fraud claims. The other thing, I'm sorry, just to go back to mention is we also, in the course of the investigation, interviewed Rudy Giuliani. And one of the things that we asked him, if you recall, in the message, and I can't remember which senator it was for, but in the message that he left, he said, referenced the fact that he was calling on fellow Republicans. And in the interview, we asked him, why did you say you were calling on your fellow Republicans? And he said, well, I wasn't going to be calling Democrats about this. Even some Republicans wouldn't go along with this. And so, of course, I would call only Republicans. And in fact, that was consistent with our investigation throughout, that the people that President Trump and his co-conspirators reached out to were people who they thought would go along or help them because of party allegiance. And Giuliani in particular would reference that he expected their cooperation because they were Republican.
He talks about the proffers from Trump co-conspirators like Giuliani and how Smith was ready to have Donald Trump as a witness during that case. Play this clip.
Were you planning on calling John Eastman as a witness?
I do not believe we would have, but we would have welcomed if the defense called him.
Okay. It gets tricky, though, for the defense to call him because the people like Eastman and Clark and Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, I mean, they were shrouded by the special counsel as, co-conspirators 1 through 6. And so they all feared that they were going to be prosecuted if they said anything. Isn't that fair?
Well, they were co-conspirators. I can't get into what was in their mind or not. I can tell you some of the co-conspirators met with us in proffers and did interviews with us. And so the idea that someone like Rudy Giuliani, who sat with a proffer for us, he was available as a witness, and we would have welcomed President Trump calling him as a witness. Boris Epstein sat for an interview with us. We would have welcomed calling him as a witness. Kenneth Chesborough, we would have welcomed it.
Why didn't you charge any of those?
I'm sorry?
Why didn't you charge any of those co-conspirators?
As we stated in the final report, we analyzed the evidence against different co-conspirators. My staff determined that we did have evidence to charge people at a certain point in time. I had not made final determinations about that at the time that President Trump won re-election, meaning that our office was going to be closed down.
And then finally, someone asks, to the extent members of Congress and senators are up in arms that this happened to them and are seeking accountability, what's your message, Jack Smith? Here's what Jack Smith says. Play this clip.
You know, to the extent members of Congress and senators are up in arms that this happened to them and they're seeking accountability, who should be held accountable for answering these questions?
Well, I think who should be accountable for this is Donald Trump. These records are people, in the case of the senators, Donald Trump directed his co-conspirators to call these people to further delay the proceedings. He chose to do that. If Donald Trump had chosen to call a number of Democratic senators, we would have got toll records for a number of Democratic senators. So responsibility for why these records, why we collected them, that lies with Donald Trump.
Well, I understand that.
Well, there you have it, folks. That's the condensed highlights, but I do suggest if you have the time for it, go and watch the full YouTube video of this deposition, because I had to pick what I thought were some of the most important clips there. I could have picked a lot more clips. Go and watch the full one. I just want you to see how a smart career prosecutor answers questions honestly, directly, and I think it's in such contrast to what we see with MAGA and all their lies and conspiracies. So if you have the time, check it out. Thanks for watching. Let's hit 6 million subscribers together. Thank you.
Love this video? Support independent media and unlock exclusive content, ad-free videos, and custom emojis by becoming a paid member of our YouTube channel today. You can also gift memberships to others. Let's keep growing together.